Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. We are so excited that you're here, and happy Black History Month. And it's great to see some of you that I've just seen throughout the month, and some of you that I haven't seen for a while. So it's great to be back in person again. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the Lyceum for tonight's lecture. But tonight it gives me great pleasure to talk about my colleague, Dr. Ben Skolnik, who's here with us tonight. Dr. Benjamin A. Skolnik is a public archaeologist and historic GIS specialist with the Office of Historic Alexandria. He received his Bachelor's of Art degree from the College of William and Mary in History and Anthropology in 2007. Dr. Skolnik received his Master's of Applied Anthropology degree with a focus on heritage in 2012, as well as his PhD from the University of Maryland's Department of Anthropology in 2019. His dissertation was on GIS, Geographic Information Systems, mapping historic sites, slavery, and plantation landscapes. Dr. Skolnik has been an archaeologist with the City of Alexandria since 2015, and he works on a wide range of subjects, including most recently the new southern route of the African American Heritage Trail, and we just launched that last Saturday, so we're really excited. If you haven't, please check it out on your website. It's a wonderful trail that you can walk yourself or that you can actually use through your phone. So we're so excited about that, and we were so happy to promote it, and we were even excited when WTOP had us down at the waterfront at 6:30 a.m. last Sunday morning to promote the trails. So we do everything for history. We love history in this department. Ben is also involved with the Freedom House Museum at 1315 Duke Street, and since 2019. And at that time, he wrote a couple of pages that he has written to me today that actually he was saying in hindsight were a prototype for the talk tonight. His Building and Property History at 1315 Duke Street, Alexandria, Virginia report came out in January 2021 and details most of what we know about the building. Dr. Skolnik has worked extensively with Smith Group on the Historic Structures report for Freedom House and continues his work with them on the master plan phase of work on Freedom House, which we are just starting now and are very excited about. As part of his work as a core team leader for the Freedom House site, his duties have permitted him to take a deep dive into all things Freedom House. And tonight we're really excited that Dr. Skolnik is going to share his work with looking at the illustrated images of the site and what those images can tell us. So it gives me great pleasure to give us to the audience our resident expert on 1315 Duke Street, Dr. Ben Skolnik.
Thank you. So thank you, Audrey. I'm happy to be here. My introduction to 1315 Duke Street and the former slave pen there began in this room just under 4 years ago. The Office of Historic Alexandria at the time was beginning to ramp up its interpretive efforts at the site, and we had invited Professor Josh Rothman from the University of Alabama to come and give a talk to us. At the time, he was working on his book, The Ledger and the Chain, and he is the sort of the world's foremost expert on Franklin and Armfield and their slave trading business, which was headquartered at this building between 1828, 1836 or 1837. And so he came and he gave us a talk, sort of laying out what he knew about our site and the business that was running the domestic slave trade out of this site. Throughout the course of that talk, there are things that came up that either were unknown or he wasn't quite sure about. I think at that time, I took it upon myself to get to the bottom of what it was we didn't know about the building. And so looking back the last 3.5 or 4 years that I've been diving at every photograph, newspaper, article, any historical shred or scrap about the building, there's nothing new. The major the highlights people before me have covered, but I like to think that we've been able to fill in a lot of the gaps in our knowledge. And I think we have a much clearer understanding of how this specific building was used over the course of the 19th century through the domestic slave trade. And so I think Audrey alluded to it a little bit. My background is in archaeology and historical archaeology, and I think that makes me history adjacent. But I think that's I come at history from a slightly different perspective, I think, than a lot of other historians do. And so I'm always interested in the places and the things, and maybe not so much the people, because as an archaeologist, it's sometimes hard to get to people. But this is a place, and this is a thing, and I can understand places and things pretty well. And so over the course of this talk, we're going to talk about this building, which some of it is still at 1315 Duke Street. And so we're not the first to suggest that looking at 1315 Duke Street is a worthwhile endeavor. Over the course of the Civil War, tens of thousands of Union troops came through Alexandria over the course of the war. And many of them, being from northern cities like New York or Boston, had never seen a slave jail before. It was a very uniquely Southern piece of architecture to them, and many of them wrote about it. And after visiting the Marshall House on King Street to see where Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was shot, the second thing they would all do was come and see the slave jail down on Duke Street. And they would write about it, they would take pieces of it home as souvenirs, and they would reflect on the thing that they had seen. And I think a lot of them sort of connected this building and buildings like it across the South with the reason that they had to fight a war. Certainly by the end of the war, a lot of people were making this connection. And so I don't know if this is official, but 1315 Duke Street, the slave jail, may be the best documented structure in the city during the course of the Civil War. I see Al nodding his head over there. So between 1861 and 1865, between the written accounts, newspaper descriptions, official Civil War write-ups, maps, and then all of the images and photographs we're going to see tonight, we have a view of most of the building. There's still pieces of it that we haven't seen historically and we never see historically. That doesn't mean we don't understand sort of what the building is doing and what pieces of it were there. And so it may be the best documented structure during the course of the Civil War, which for us is great because prior to the Civil War, when this building was used as a slave pen, there's really only one good visual depiction of it that lets us sort of piece together how this building was used, where the slave pens were, how enslaved people were being held inside this building. And so using the Civil War era documentation of the structure, we can peel back a little bit with the one image we do have when it was used as a slave pen. And then we can use a couple of other historic pieces to fill in some of the gaps we have. And I think collectively it paints a very detailed picture of the history of our site. And so just real quick, get this out of the way. Here's Duke Street, down the way a little bit. Here is the current building in blue. There is West Street on the left, Payne Street on the right, and then Prince Street behind it. Jumping back a little bit, here is the structure as it was mapped during the Civil War. Again, with the current structure on top of it. The building has changed a little bit over the years. The most recent addition is this 1984 office addition, which accounts for most of this added blue area there. And so just for the purposes of this talk, this is the building we're talking about. This is the slave jail at 1315 Duke Street. I see him in the way over here. This image comes out of the Historic Structures Report that the city worked on with Smith Group and is currently our best understanding for how the building appeared historically. It's a little bit different than you'll see in some of the photographs. The most notable difference is the roof here over this yard or pen area to the west of the main block. And we'll get there in a second. But so this is the building we're talking about. And I think when I give tours inside the building or when I talk to the frontline staff who talk to people every day when they're in the building, one of the questions that they always get asked, or I always get asked, is what's real, what's left? What can I touch inside this building that was left over from the slave pen? And so doing this work, we're able to answer that question and direct people to the pieces of this building that are visible. The vast majority of the brick of the building is still there, but it's covered, it's hidden, and there's only a couple places where you can get to it. So the structure of this talk, it's one part history of visual images and one part piecing together all of these pieces and getting to how we know what we know about the building. So I said a minute ago, we have one good pre-Civil War image of the building, and it falls into a genre of image, of an engraving, I guess, that was fairly common during the middle of the 19th century. The anti-slavery or the abolition movement would publish almanacs or broadsides. There would be long passages of text, and they were illustrated with images like these. And so generally they're little vignettes. They are scenes typical of American slavery. You frequently get family separations, violence against enslaved people. They're being used ideologically to further the anti-slavery cause. Sometimes you get specific historic incidents, breaking up of printing presses, attacks by mobs on free schools, images like this. And so 1836, the American Anti-Slavery Society published this broadside titled Slave Market in America. If you've been to our site, you've seen this image. And so what they're tackling here is the slave trade in the District of Columbia. The slave trade in the District of Columbia took on a particular touchstone during, for the anti-slavery movement. The understanding is that DC is controlled by the federal government, and the federal government should take a moral stand against slavery. And it may not be within the ability of people from New York or Boston to end slavery in the South, but they had a say in whether or not slavery continued in place like Washington, DC. And so a lot of the early anti-slavery movement, certainly before 1850, targeted Washington, DC specifically as a site of slavery, enslavement, and the slave trade specifically. And at the time, Alexandria is a part of the District of Columbia. And so they put out this broadside. There are 9 images. 7 of them are not 1315 Duke Street, and those are some of these: DC jail, the Alexandria jail, the city or the county jail, some DC slave pens. But then we get this one at the top. This is 1836 Franklin Armfield Slave Prison. And so if you look at it, it's a 3-story brick building. You have a fairly similar chimney to what we have now. And then you can see in the foreground, coming down Duke Street, there's presumably a white employee of the business. It may be John Armfield himself, directing a gang of enslaved people down Duke Street. And then from the context of the broadside, they're being taken to the waterfront to be put on a ship and sent to New Orleans. And so the building here, 1836, it's got the offices, which is what the Office of Historic Alexandria has turned into the Freedom House Museum. You have the women's yard, this tall, 12 or 15-foot high brick walled in area just to the east of the chimneys. You can't see my mouse there. And then around the whole site is a tall, high fence. So that's our only good pre-Civil War image of the slave jail. And so every time I have a photograph of our site, I have to look at the photograph and figure out where this photograph lies in the sequence of changes that happens to the building. We'll get into it in a minute, but there's a series of, most of them are fairly small changes that accumulate over time. And then I always come back to this image here. Okay, so that's the only one we know it exists. There was another in the 1840s, a man named William Wells Brown, himself a former enslaved person, pulled together a traveling panorama. I don't know if panoramas are a visual medium people are terribly familiar with these days, but like think giant painting on like scrolls. And so William Wells Brown, he had maybe 20 or, excuse me, let me back up. This is a panorama. This isn't William Wells Brown's. We don't have William Wells Brown's, but this is sort of what it is that that he's put together. It's a series of scenes that go across a long canvas, scrolls on one end, and then there's a narrative or somebody gets up just like this and talks about each scene. And as the program progresses, the painting moves across the stage and it reveals more and more of the story. And so we have the description of William Wells' panorama, but not the image itself, which is unfortunate because I'd love to have a painting of 1315 Duke Street. This one is a series done of the Mississippi River. An artist sailed down the Mississippi River and painted as he went. I picked this one because of my background as an archaeologist. He's showing an excavation of an Indian burial mound. But we have the description of William Wells's panorama. There's actually two paintings, just like with the broadside. One shows the building itself, and the other shows ships down at the Alexandria harbor for the purpose of taking slaves down to New Orleans. But unfortunately, we don't have it. If anybody has this in their attic, I'd be more than happy to get a plaque and we'll put it up in the museum. But I think the last anybody saw it was in the 1840s somewhere in Europe. And so I don't have a lot of faith that William Wells Brown's panoramic views of the American slave trade are going to show up again. And then there's one more image. I only show this to be thorough. This is an 1853 bird's eye view of the city. It's not as commonly used as the 1863 bird's eye view taken from the river. But I thought I'd show it because it's pre-Civil War and I only showed you the one. If you zoom in, so just to orient you, this is taken up at like King Street's the big street going up the slide here. And then this is the cotton factory. So we're at like Pendleton or Orinoco, looking to the south, 1853. And so you look way off in this part of town over where Duke Street would be, and you can't quite make out any specific buildings. The chimney at 1315 Duke Street is unique enough that in the 1863 broadside you can pick it out, but I don't think any of these are intended to be specific buildings. So I apologize. Okay, so pre-Civil War, into the Civil War. On May 23rd, 1861, Virginia voted to secede from the Union. The following morning, a number of regiments of Union infantry were here in Alexandria. And then from then to the end of the war, Alexandria was an occupied, or when I give these kinds of talks, I like to say it's a liberated city. But there's a couple of different kinds of documentation. When you look at the Civil War documentation we have, there's a couple of different kinds that fall under a couple of different categories. So the first couple are newspaper advertisements. I'm always talking about newspaper advertisements. Newspaper articles. And so just aside from a moment, the written prose descriptions of the slave jail, we do have two illustrations that appear in illustrated newspapers. This one shows the events of May 24th, 1861, the invading or the occupying, whichever verb you want to use, Union infantry captures secessionist cavalry at 1315 Duke Street. They're using the site as their headquarters. And the image here is drawn from the perspective of Duke Street there, where the soldiers lined up. That is Payne Street in front of that building in front of us, and it's looking towards 1315 Duke Street on the left. And so It doesn't show us the building itself very well, but we get a sense of the yard, the roof over the yard, this building that stretches back behind the women's yard on the east. It shows us a fence that doesn't show up in any of the other Civil War photographs. And it shows a couple other buildings, like this long featureless building to the left of, I think this is 217 South Prince, which is probably a stable barn kind of building. We know those structure, the stable, we know the fence exists on the site from post-Civil War claims that the owner files with the federal government, but we don't have any other good documentation for it, except the stable here. So this appeared in Harper's Weekly. The other one appears in the New York Illustrated News. This depicts an event that occurred February 4th, 1862. After the Union Army moved into the city, they found pretty quickly they needed a place to use as a jail or a prison, not to store or house captured Confederate prisoners, although there probably were a couple, but as a place to keep drunk, disorderly, unruly soldiers who didn't want to be soldiers, guys who took swings at their officers, people caught without a pass or with bad passes, and then some troublemaking Alexandrians who the military authorities needed to put somewhere. And so they turned the former slave pen into a military prison. And so the evening of February 4th, 1862, a Union soldier freezes to death inside the slave jail at 1315 Duke Street. And I think it causes sort of a couple things to happen. First, it's a national scandal. It rises to the level of congressional hearings that were held because a soldier froze to death. It feels ironic and I don't know, fitting in a way. I don't know what the word is I'm trying to use. That this building that was a slave pen for the better part of 30 or 35 years, suddenly all of a sudden a soldier freezes to death and then people seem to care about it. And so I think what ends up happening when you line up all the images and look at all the textual sources is that very quickly after this February 4th incident, a roof goes over this yard and a couple other physical changes happen to the building that I think sometimes researchers conflate with the slave pen period. And it actually, many times Civil War soldiers themselves, especially ones that don't show up here until 1864 or 1865, who don't understand the previous history of the building, report US military prison infrastructure as if it were slave jail infrastructure. So for example, we'll get to it in a minute, but you've all, if you haven't seen it, you'll see it in a second, but the rows of cells in the slave jail. We don't have any evidence that those cells existed before 1862, before this event. And so every photograph we have of the building shows a roof, a full roof over the men's yard on the left. There's no evidence that that roof existed prior to 1862. And so the sort of the public perception of this building and how it's used prior to the Civil War during its slave pen period is very heavily influenced by, I think, changes that happened as a result of this soldier freezing to death in 1862. Other kinds of documentation during the Civil War, not just news reporting, but the Army itself needed to sort of keep track of what it was doing. There is a photographer running around here in Alexandria and a couple other places sort of in the Eastern Theater. His name's Andrew J. Russell. He starts off as a soldier. He gets taught how to do photography by a photographer. And then very quickly, the general in charge of military logistics, the military railroad here in the city, realizes that this is a valuable skill for the quartermaster's office for the railroad to have. And so he sort of detaches him from his unit and he directs him to photograph military things. And so this is, for example, is the United States Military Railroad photographic album. There's a couple copies of this or versions of this that float around. And some of the photographs are very dry, very technical. He's taking pictures of building bridges, making blanket boats, building more bridges, rows of cannons. He's not documenting battlefields. He's not really, although he does, he sneaks away at Fredericksburg. He's not taking portraits of generals. He's documenting like the boring logistics stuff that armies do to run wars. Later on, the general in his memoirs describes what Andrew Russell is doing, putting together this album. Here's some technical descriptions. And then so Andrew Russell, he takes pictures like this. So here's some train depots. Here's the guys building a stockade around the rail yard. These two are notable because 1315 Duke Street would be in these photos. If the roundhouse wasn't there, you'd be able to see it. And if the stockade here in the center wasn't there, you'd be able to see it. If you look really closely, there are these little gun ports cut in the wall. And I've spent hours trying to see the building through the little gun ports, and the photographer just, it didn't work out. So it's there, it's right behind that wooden wall, you'll have to believe me. Other times he takes photos of hospitals here, and behind that is Soldiers Rest. And if you blow this photo up and look really closely in the background, you'll see a very blurry, very small 1315 Duke Street. But other times he's useful to us, and he takes pictures like this. So from on top of the roundhouse, he's documenting, again, more Civil War military logistics infrastructure, the trains and some of the railroad depot. This is the commissary, I think, here in the foreground. But then just behind that, sort of at those two crossroads, is 1315 Duke Street. You can see the whitewashed painted building behind it. And so this photograph we've stared at for hours, trying to peer down into the yards. So I started this talk off by saying that I'm an archaeologist and I approach history a little differently. And so this happens all the time with archaeology. Is you're digging a site, you find a foundation in the ground, and you want to know what it looked like. And nobody in the history of forever has taken a picture of the thing you want to look at. And so you have to go, and the thing you want is always in the background of some other photograph. It's behind a tree, it's cut off at the edge. If the photographer turned this much further to the right, you'd see it. And so I'm actually pleased we have as many views as this that we do. And then Andrew Russell also took this photograph here. This is probably the closest, best up close photograph of the front of 1315 Duke Street. And then there's sort of another reason that the Civil War was documented, and then especially towards the end, people wanted to know why they had just fought the Civil War. And at that point in the war, it had become apparent that one of the outcomes of the war was ending slavery. It didn't start off that way, but by the end, that was one of the reasons why the war was fought. And so people like Alexandra Gardner, who sort of at one point within that Matthew Brady circle, set out to publish this 2-volume set, 50 photographs in each volume, so 100 total photographs, sort of a retrospective of the war. This gets published in 1866. And so I just want to focus on this here for a second, because the photograph that shows up in this album gives me trouble and grief, because I think their caption's not right. And so they're saying, we're putting this volume together because photographs are, they're visual. And then the phrase they use here, is it the first sentence of the last paragraph. Verbal representations of such places or scenes may or may not have the merit of accuracy, but photographic presentments of them will be accepted by posterity with an undoubting faith. We live in an era of Photoshop, and so I hear all of you chuckling, but it's very easy to look at a photograph and go, yes, I can see that. I can believe that this is what it looks like. And so there are Civil War era versions of Photoshop jobs where researchers have found photographs of like General Grant with his head cut off and put on a different horse's body, horseman's body. But the idea that a photograph is something visual, it's supposedly a real reflection of a scene that existed. It carries a weight to it, and I think it's why there's so many people here in this room listening to me talk about photographs and images of a slave jail. There's some kind of kernel of truth behind those images. And so just for a second, this is the photograph that appears of the slave jail. And they write some text about slave pens and how the building was used. The problem with this photograph is, number one, the image itself is underexposed a little bit. And so you can see that there's a very whitewashed, very bright building, and it's lost some of the detail in it. And so, what was that phrase I just used? Undoubting faith. They've gone in and they've painted in, they've drawn in the edge of this building here, and then the chimneys. You can't see them in the original print because the print is too blown out. The highlights have been lost. And so they're presenting us an image, but they've had to go back in and draw parts of the image so that we can see it. So that's number one. But number two is, this date here says August 1862. There's other editions of this book that tell us August 1863. And so they both can't be right. And if you keep reading, it says entered into accord of the Act of Congress, copyright something something, 1865. And then I think there may, on some editions, even be another date, negative by William Pywell, 1866. So this image is all over the place. We see it a lot, and in a little bit, if I have time, we see versions of this photograph reproduced with 1861 era events transposed onto them. And so we'll get to it, but I think this actually is 1865. I think this is one of the last photographs we have from the Civil War of our slave jail. And there's a couple of visual clues that we'll get to that I think conclusively prove that that's the case. So this isn't a talk about doing Civil War photography or the process of engraving wooden blocks and transferring images. But that'd be a cool lecture, and I'd like to listen to it. But that's way beyond my expertise. And so you'll just have to imagine that we understand how that process works. It's a photograph. I think we're all on the same page. In some cases, so for example, this 1836 image, it's sort of drawn from the perspective of the intersection of Duke Street and Payne Street to the east of the site. There's a number of other visual depictions of the building that also show a very similar framing of it. And so I don't think it's specifically, I don't think there's an X on the ground that says stand here to take a picture of the slave jail. I think number one, it's the first glimpse you get of the slave jail as you go up Duke Street. And number two, I think this image may have been influential enough that when people thought of 1315 Duke Street, that was sort of the only mental picture a lot of people had in their heads of this building, if they have one at all. And so I think at least one of these photographs, this one, may have intentionally been taken to replicate that view, to draw on that previous visual anchor. Other times you see, for example, an original photograph like this one up here at the top, and then you get artists who sit down and it's clear that they're copying straight from the photograph. Other times you have the same thing, but it's done not for an artist to produce a piece of art, but to translate a photograph into a medium that is more easily printable. So for example, this image here shows up in late 19th century textbooks, American history textbooks. There's this one and there's a similar one that I've got towards the end, where an artist sits down, takes the photograph and copies it as an engraving. And so this is the photograph we were just talking about. This is one of the original glass plate. I flip up and I call it a negative, but it's not a negative, but it functions as a negative. But this is one of the original images that produces that image. And I say one of because there's at least 4 others. You're all familiar with stereo views, right? So like you remember Viewmasters, the little orange, right? I see. So it's 2 images, a left and a right. You put them together in special goggles, and it's a 3D image there in front of you. If you grew up like I did in the 90s, we were given these all the time in school. You sit there and you cross your eyes, and you can turn this into 3D without doing anything else. You don't even need special glasses. You can just sit here and go cross-eyed while I talk. And then this will turn itself into a 3-dimensional image. But we have not 1, but 5 different exposures taken from this vantage point, which is fitting because this is the one that gives me the most trouble. And then those images were mass produced and turned into these stereoscopic view cards. Here's 4 that I found. I thought there was one more that I thought I had, but I guess I didn't. And then this is other reproductions of this image, not Xeroxed or copied as photographs, but turned into engravings. This one at the bottom in the middle is the one I was referring to. So as near as I can tell, this is the building as it would have appeared 1865 at the end of the war, but the event that is depicting is the surrender of the Confederate cavalry on the very first day of the war here in Alexandria. So it's this interesting juxtaposition of the visual identity of the building changes over time. And a lot of the times, I mean, the artist who drew these pictures didn't have the keyword search genealogy databases that I have in my office. And so they can't search all of the 19th century newspapers. If they didn't read it when it came off the press, they didn't piece together that the building changed over time. And then this one especially causes trouble. Here's the photograph in the Alexander Gardner sketchbook of the war, juxtaposed with this drawing. And if you look closely, the drawing is dated 1862, like one of the pictures is, but it looks not like the building is supposed to look in 1862, and it looks suspiciously like a copy of the photograph. And so this comes from a sketchbook and a diary of a Civil War soldier named Robert Knox Sneeden, or I've heard it pronounced Snedden, and I don't know which is correct. And so he has a fairly famous Civil War diary that's down at the Virginia Historical Society, and he kept during the war. But I think what also happened is that after the war, he sat down to sort of illustrate his memoirs, and he had a copy of some of Gardner's photographs, and you can see his drawings here on the right juxtaposed with images that appear in Gardner's sketchbook of the war. And so I think I don't know if he's intending to pass it off as his own view. I imagine that these are fairly known views when he's doing his memoirs. But when it comes to our building, I think something fairly similar is happening where he's got this photograph. It's dated 1862 or 1863. He was here, we know he was here in 1862, but I think he's copying the building that appears in the photograph and not necessarily as it was when he was here in 62. To compound his, how frustrating he is sometimes to deal with, he has another illustration from here in Alexandria, and he notes that there is a slave pen that's been deserted sort of up towards the top of King Street. And I've scratched my head. I know other people have scratched their head trying to make sense out of this thing that he's drawn here. And I thought I had a good lead, and I thought I had it figured out, and I don't know. There's a number of slave jails, slave pens here in the city, and I can't make any of them work. Anyway, that's also in the back of my head, living rent-free. So we have this wealth of photographic, these depictions of the building. The piece we need to do is be able to place them in space so that when we start documenting and trying to figure out what's original, what's not, how did the building change over time, we can go about and do that. And so there are 3 good Civil War era maps that show the slave jail at 1315 Duke Street. There's probably 1 or 2 more that aren't good and show some building there, but they're not worth taking time for the purposes of this talk. And so these maps are created largely for, again, those boring military logistics purposes. There's an army here for 4 or 5 years. There's not an immediate battle here in Alexandria, and so they're just doing the logistics. They're moving piles of hay from one part to another. They're dealing with coal, rails, all this stuff. And so the quartermaster needs to know like where stuff is, which buildings they have taken over. And so the slave jail shows up on these two maps. It's this purple thing here on the left, and then this building labeled W here. And you can see sort of the main block of the building. This is the main block that was built 1812 or 1813. And then sort of the original kitchen wing behind it. And then in some maps, they're connected, and some they're not. And then you get a sense of the complex that sort of surrounds it. And then this is the other map that shows it. This is the US Military Railroad depot here in Alexandria. And then it shows the slave pen. And so armed with those maps, armed with the photographs, and then armed with not the Civil War era descriptions, because while they're helpful, they don't explain sort of how these spaces are being used when it's a slave jail. If we turn back instead to some of the mid-19th century abolitionist accounts of the building, we can piece together not just where the photographs were, but how each of these spaces was used, what it looked like, and then probably most importantly, how it differs from what's in the photographs. When people ask what's real, what's left over from the slave pen, the really good answer, the easiest answer is this brick wall here. This is now in the alley to the left of 1315 Duke Street. You can see part of this brick wall is inside the men's yard to the left of the building. And then this photograph here is dated circa 1900. There's not a great date on it, but we can narrow it down probably a little bit, certainly before 1907. And then if you look really closely, you can see the original outline to the slave jail here, and then you can see the sloping roof, and then the cupola or the monitor ridge vent running down the top, sort of in the brickwork of the building post-Civil War, after the men's yard has been torn down. And so that brings me to the archaeology piece, which is establishing a chronology. And as an archaeologist, that's what we do, right? We figure out how old stuff is. And so there's a problem in that all these Civil War era photos don't have like metadata the way that our cell phone pictures have metadata. And so if you go to places like the Library of Congress, they'll say, this is the listing. It says Civil War time between 1860 and 1870. And you go, thank you, Library of Congress. I knew that from all the Civil War soldiers in my photograph. And so we're left sort of on our own to piece together when these photographs were all taken. Then you get photographs like this that have 2 different dates. I think neither of them are actually correct. So sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes the artist gives you the date on the page. So he says this was drawn May 14th, 1863. Other times you have to turn a page or two, but there you go. June 15th, 1861. It describes an event that we know the date of. So that's helpful. This one has a date, April 15, 1864. And there's a blurry 1315 Duke Street there in the haze. And here's a similar view. This one doesn't have a date stamped on it the way the previous one did. The image is a little bit better, and so it makes me want to know the date. And you can do a little bit of historic research or legwork. You figure out this is the camp of the 44th New York Infantry. There's a giant 44 hanging from the central arch. You open up their regimental history. They tell you that on March 20th, 1864, an artist from Matthew Brady's studio came out and take pictures of their camp. And they go on to describe the camp, and it's this camp. And so we could say that this photograph, and there's a whole sequence of this panorama that's taken from on top of Shooter's Hill. It's taken March 20th, 1864. If we didn't have this date, we could probably get pretty close. There's a couple of photographs in this series taken from the bottom of the hill looking back up. And there in the center arch, they have a couple of shields, or I don't remember exactly what they are, but on them they've painted the names of the battles that the regiment has gone through. And so it says stuff like, I don't remember exactly what they were, but they say stuff like, First Bull Run, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and then they stop after the campaign of 63, and there's no Civil War battles from 1864 or 1865. And so the assumption is, if you've listed all the Civil War battles up to 1863, and in the winter, and you don't have any from 64, it's not that you ran out of room, it's that you're taking this photograph in 1864, the winter of 63, 64, and you just haven't lived that yet. You get photos like this one. This is the Andrew Russell, and then you can start doing some sleuthing. So, for example, this building here, we know this building burns in October of 1862, and so if this building is shown as a ruin in the photograph has to date to after October 1862. Which is all well and good, except we know Andrew Russell didn't start showing up here in Alexandria taking photographs until 1863. And so I did all that legwork, and it's nice to know the same thing like twice. So I'm doubly certain. So back to this photograph real quick. Here's the building on the left in the Civil War. Here it is again, circa 1929. You can see that the yard has been torn down, and so doing the sequence of events here, that one comes first, then this one, and then in the one from 1929, you can see that they've gone and added a fourth story to the main block of the building, where here it's only a 3-story building with a regular gable roof, whereas in 1929 it's a mansard roof. And so we can say that this photograph falls in between these other 2 photographs. And so doing that, we're able to sort of piece together this sequence fairly well. Real quick, I don't want to spend a lot of time because we have places to be. And I think people want to go home at some point. I mean, I could talk for like 3 hours if you let me. But so if a lot of this is covered in the historic structures report pulled together by Smith Group. But these are sort of the good Civil War photographs. These 4 from the outside, sort of coming from the west, swinging back around to the east. These 2 from sort of far away, the left one from up on top of Shooter's Hill, the right one from on top of the Roundhouse, sort of just peering down just enough over the walls to make them enticing. And then these 3 from inside the men's yard to the west of the main block. So here's the Civil War map, and these arrows are sort of the views we have from the Civil War. And you can see that we've got fairly good coverage documenting the structure from the Civil War. Again, if you're interested, pull up the historic structures report. In one of the appendices, we've gone and added some of these annotated images that sort of walk through not just surviving features and where we think building features are in the present related to these photographs, but thoughts and things that couldn't go anywhere else. Brain jottings, I don't know what to call them. So this is sort of, we spent hours on the phone sort of staring at these, and I still find new things in these photographs. Like this one at the top here, there's actually Civil War graffiti on the wall behind those soldiers that you can't see unless you zoom all the way in. I can't read it. It's just blurry enough that I can't read what it says. All right, so wrapping up, how do we document change at the site? We can take a photograph like this. We can do a little bit of computer stuff, some GIS computer magic, overlay like modern lines on top of the building, and come away with sort of this Civil War era picture of the building with sort of the modern changes that have been done to the building. So you can see we've lost the door in the center there. The windows have all been enlarged. The arches over the windows have all been changed. The roof line has been changed. We've added those 2 dormers. The piece to remember is that this only works for one specific plane of the building, and as you get back towards the chimney or behind where those yards are, the perspective breaks apart, and so I apologize. But so change. One of the things that I think happens over the life of this building is the men's yard here increases in height. I think I mentioned earlier, the Civil War sees a roof go over top of it. Armed with this image from 1836, and then the pre-Civil War era city tax lists, we get a fairly good sense of what the owners are being taxed for at the site, what the value the property is being assessed at. And so most of the slave jail components seem to be built by 1835 or 1836. And so this picture sort of captures the building as it would have appeared more or less for the duration of the slave pen period. I said earlier, we know that there's a fence around the whole site prior to the Civil War, and we know there's a stable. This photograph on the left, I didn't recognize as a unique new photograph until relatively recently, because it looks so similar to this other one that we already have. But if you look closely in the back there, there's a stable or a barn here just behind the building that by the time this photograph has been taken, it's gone. It's been torn down. And so the guy who owns the building, his brother-in-law was the slave trader. He sold it to him during the Civil War, I think to try to not get it confiscated by the army, which didn't work super great. But he petitions Congress for rent and for his fence and his barn, and it was denied. But we know these things were there. We can compare the pre-February 4th freezing of the soldier with the post-February 4th, 1862 photographs of the yard. You can see it's not covered in this illustration. In this one it is. But if you look closely, you can see previous evidence of a former roof line. You can see these mortise holes up here against this wall. You can see this diagonal line that mirrors the roof timbers, the rafters up above it. You can see this piece of wood up here that's been sawed off. And then when you look at this other view coming through the store the other way, there's a matching one on the other side, almost like, I don't know what the architectural term is, a ridge pole or something, spanning the stretch of the yard to carry the old version of this little shed roof. There's a whole bunch of pre-February 4th Civil War references to the building. Saying stuff like there's no roof, it's covered with a small shed roof, it's uncovered, and then after that you start getting these that say there's a roof on top. This one here from the Boston Traveler is our first evidence that there's cells in this space. This one I think is, it's only a month and a half after the soldier freezes to death. In the Chicago Daily Tribune, it says the pen has two large enclosures. One is 50 feet long, the other 30 by 20. And then he says these were open at the top to the weather, which I think is telling because the rest of this passage is all in the present tense, has, is. And then here in March 28th, 62, he's using the word were to describe how it was open at the top. And so he doesn't say it, but I think reading between the lines and with all this other evidence, it's implying that he's trying to convey to us what this building was prior to these army changes as a result of the soldier freezing to death. And in fact, again, in the Chicago Daily Tribune, it says on March 4th, exactly a month afterwards, offers a great contrast to what it was a month ago. And so there's clearly some infrastructure, some improvement to this building that happens. And I think it's the roof goes on and these cells go in. And this is probably the best like before and after. This photograph with the wagon is one or two of the earliest photographs we have. And then this one over here at the end is probably the last Civil War photograph we have. And because the views are so similar, it's really good for doing this before and after. So this is the audience participation piece. What changes do you see? Yeah, the tree. The tree took me forever. So I think the tree is the key to figuring out that this is not an 1862 or 1863 photograph. So you see this tree here. This tree is clearly in the front of the yard. This tree is to the west of the yard. This tree is to the west of the yard. There's no tree between the edge of the yard and the front of the edge of this building. There is this one stump here And then I can't tell if this is a stump or like a wagon step, but there's no tree. So either there was a tree and then the army cut it down before and after, or there was a tree and then the army cut it down, but then the army planted an identical looking tree in the same spot. And so it doesn't make sense. And so the short of it is that when you line up some of these changes, we'll get there in a second. So other changes real quick. The windows. So there's 3 windows here. There's no windows over there. I've stared so long at that brickwork in this photograph and in all the other photographs with no windows to see if there's a ghost outline where it was bricked up, and there's nothing. So again, if they did have windows and then bricked them up, they did such a good job covering up the hole that like they didn't do a good job here. And in the photo of the inside of the yard, there's ghost openings in that brick wall, and you can see they did not do a good job. What else? Yeah, there is the sign. The sign's painted. The letters are actually paint, but I think what you're picking up is the band, that whitewashed band. And so over the course of the war, the band fades, and we actually know that the building was whitewashed a bunch of times during the war. There's one account that somebody whitewashed over the sign, and the commanding officer was outraged that somebody would try to cover that up. And I think he wanted the Alexandrians to know that this used to be a slave jail, and now it's a Union military prison. And so he had his soldiers go out and take the whitewashed band off of the sign. So the condition of the sign fades over the war. What else? Which roof? I think it's cut off. Yeah, shutters. The shutters disappeared during the war, right? Probably into the fireplaces. It's hard to tell from these two, but the Andrew Russell photograph, you can see it really well. We're like missing actual windows, like whole windows are gone. The sashes disappear. Other times a couple panes are punched out. There's accounts of guys, Union soldiers being held here, escaping through the windows, jumping out like second-story windows to try to get away. The other change that it's hard to tell, you really got to stare at it. This entire roof line over the men's yard actually changes during the Civil War. And so this is the first version of it. It's a much shallower slope. And it's easier to see from the zoomed out views, but that vent, that monitor ridge line thing at the top, it's one long continuous structure. Whereas in this later photograph, it gets reconfigured to these 2 separate ones. So like if you look really closely on this one, you can actually see the former roof line here. So here's the top of the roof, and there's this triangular shaped wedge that goes up. And this is brick here, and from the top of the brick to the bottom of the roof is actually like this pine, this vertical board. I don't know what, again, I'm an archaeologist. By the time I find it, it's all rotted away. But it's this like wood structure built up, almost like a delta wedge. And so that changes over the war too. And so the amount of changes between that photograph and this photograph, when we look at some of the other ones, especially like the aerial photograph, the photograph from on top of Shooter's Hill that we know is dated March 20th, 1864, this photograph doesn't make any sense if it's 62 or 63. Here, it's like a gutter. I wouldn't think so. I don't think they own that property. There's Franklin Armfield and then Kephart. They own this property, and then the one diagonal from it across Duke and across West, and there's another one on the west side of West. So I don't think they own that property, and I think that would happen in one of those buildings, like that 2-story building set back from Payne Street that we don't know what else it was used for. Okay, so wrapping up, I want to have a couple minutes for questions. more recent maps. So putting it all together, we've made sense, I think, mostly out of Civil War times. Starting in 1836, beginning of the Civil War. Some of these are dated with specific dates. Others we can say are before or after other photographs. These ones here in the center, because we can't see some of the external stuff, it's hard to say exactly where they slot into the chronology. But then they all sort of come back together again at the end of the war into the 20th century. So yeah. And that's what I've got. Just those three of the inside of the yard. None of the inside of the building. I mean, it's an office. Photographs during the Civil War are expensive. And taking pictures inside of somebody's office, it's not the most like visceral kind of photograph. You know, we have some descriptions, but they're generic. They could be any interior. I mean, we know the layout. We know there's a parlor. We have the slave pen period. We know like where they're serving their customers drinks, but we don't have any photographs of the inside. The Civil War was really rough to it as well. I mean, it's a military prison with like soldiers doing soldier stuff there for 4 years. And so there's not a whole lot that survives, interior that survives the Civil War. 1869, a developer buys it and turns it into a boarding house. And I think a good amount of the interior gets gutted then and sort of refurbished. Yeah, so the question's about, do we know how the building was built? And so the building was originally built in 1812 or 1813 for a guy named Robert Young. Robert Young's a merchant in town. He owns some ships. He's selling tobacco. He's bringing in like stuff like wine, oranges, coffee. We do know Robert Young was an enslaver. I don't know the labor that went into building the building in 1812 or 1813. Yeah, so I mean, it starts off as, the question is what other uses did it have? So it starts off as an 18th century an early 19th century residence. It gets foreclosed by the bank. Franklin and Armfield show up as tenants. They eventually buy it and they run their slave business out of it for 9 years. And then their sort of disciples run it for another 20 or 20, I'm doing math in my head, 23 years, something like that. Military prison, boarding house, and then it goes through a series where it's a boarding house, a tenement, and apartments. And so like those are sort of similar, but they're probably different enough to say 3 different things. And then in 1984, 1985, it gets retrofitted into offices. The Urban League moves in, they open up the museum in the basement in 2008. And then the city of Alexandria bought it in 2020 to turn it into a museum. That one? I was prepared for this, huh? Yeah, it was a conscious decision to not include that photograph. So here's I don't know what I want to say about this photograph yet. Check back in like 3 months. So this is one of the things that came up as a result of all of this. This one has been giving us a lot of trouble because we can't make it fit inside the building. There's one spot inside that it could fit, but it requires a couple of assumptions. So if you've been inside, you sort of go out the back hallway, you turn right past the elevator, and then you turn left again into that 1984 office addition. And so you look back towards where the original kitchen was. Now the Urban League has their offices, and you have windows that look a lot like this. There's 1, 2, 3, and then like 4 and 5 as a part of the original kitchen. The problem is that none of the maps show the passageway between the two jutting out like this. And we don't have any evidence that there was a brick thing that juts out like this. And then some of the photographs, especially the two from the one from Shooter's Hill and the one from the Roundhouse, we should be able to see this 1.5-story brick pen, and we don't have any evidence for that either. And so that's a long way of saying check back at 3 months when I get all my ducks in a row. They may not even be there. We don't exactly know. So we know Franklin and Armfield and Kephart. We know that they're on site. They have like other ancillary things happening. Some of the people who tour the site say they have a hospital, not like a hospital, but like an infirmary, a quarantine space. So like a hospital, they have a tailor shop, they have kitchens. And so I think a lot of those activities, the things that you need to do in order to run a slave jail, are happening in this building. There's also passing references to, not just here, but other people who own slave jails elsewhere are renting out space to traveling slave owners, like a boarding house, or their customers can come and stay here. And so we don't know as well as we do with some of the other pieces of the site what this specific building is, but I think we have a handle on when it was built. First the lease and then the deed from the bank to Franklin and Armfield's, it says something like in acknowledgement of the construction of certain improvements. And I think this is the certain improvements they're talking about, but they don't tell us specifically like what. So, I mean, 1315 Duke Street is the one that everybody knows and talks about. 1707 Duke is the Bruin slave jail. And then the other one is on the 15 or 1600 block of King Street. Very, very briefly, a guy named Edward Home, in 1850, when the District of Columbia outlawed the slave trade, he came across the river, set up a jail behind the Virginia House Tavern or Hotel. We know that there's a large brick yard, much like this one, from what it sounds like, on the 15 or 1600 block of King Street, sort of the south side. It's been excavated archaeologically. There wasn't anything that they could directly relate to the slave jail there. So it's one of those ones that kind of, we know sort of where it was, but there's nothing. So the question's about slave jails circa 1820, 1821. That is correct. So to my knowledge, there aren't any purpose-built structures like this in Alexandria prior to 1828, when Franklin and Armfield first rent this property. And Franklin and Armfield are some of the earliest slave traders in the country to sort of get into this kind of model of the domestic slave trade, where they have a permanent home office, they have their own jail like this. And so in those earlier years, you just have a lot of itinerant traders. They come into town, they take out a newspaper advertisement. I'm in town, I can be found at so-and-so's tavern or hotel. If you have enslaved people to sell, come find me, I'll give you the best prices. And so they hang out in town for a week, for 2 weeks. The ad maybe repeats itself once or twice. They get enough people to make their trip down south profitable for them, and then they leave town. And so those people are being held not in a jail like this, maybe they're being held in like the city jail or the county jail, but more likely they're probably in basements, attics, stables, any kind of space that they can have for them. So yes, in 1984, there's 3 different places that archaeological excavations were conducted. In the basement of the main block of the building, they lowered the floor by about 1 foot or 1.5 feet. To the east of the building, where the 1984 era office addition is now, in that footprint, is what used to be a side yard, is now the office building. They dug there, and then they also dug next door before that building went in. So it's not a 1960s building, it's a 1985, 86 building. And so they dug the parcel to the west. When they did, they found all sorts of stuff, a Civil War military privy, but also the foundation for the men's yard. It was there when they excavated. When people come to the museum now, this is probably a result of the previous exhibit, but a lot of people have in their heads that the basement was the slave jail. Like the entirety of the slave jail was in the basement. And so it's a difficult space for us to talk about and to take people into, not just because it's the basement of a slave jail and you sort of let your imagination take that where it takes you. But it's like physically hard to get to. The stairs are narrow, they're steep. There's no elevator access. On top of like, there's like water issues and mold issues that we don't want to expose people to. So we know they're used in the basement. There's textual references, like, so for example, this photograph here, this is taken from that building that's next door, looking back towards 1315 Duke Street. This is the wall that's in the alley now. There's this feature here that they found archaeologically, and it looks like a cellar entrance. And so it's a hole in the ground, it's lined with brick, and then up against the building, there's like an archway that would have allowed access from, I think it dates to when it's just a residence, outside the residence to underneath the residence. And then when Franklin Armfield turned this into a slave jail, you now have an outdoor space. Remember that this roof probably doesn't predate 1862. You have an outdoor space like a yard. I mean, yard is the word they use for it. But like a lot of the abolitionist accounts, they go out through the back, they come through this door, the abolitionists are standing here in this yard talking to like John Armfield, and then they say that somebody gave a call and up from the cellar came the enslaved. And so this like former cellar entrance is probably what they're talking about, which means that there's enslaved people using the basement. I don't know if it's sleeping, if it's temporary, but we know that they're in and out of that space. So, I mean, just like today, the city of Alexandria wants to make sure that it's taxing you for what it can. So we have good tax records going back, I mean, in some cases going back to the 18th century. We're fortunate that the copies we have are geographic, starting in about 1807. And so it's not alphabetical, but it's like the tax assessor tells you where he starts. Like at the corner of King and Prince, so-and-so has a house. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff every year that the city's keeping track of, like what you're being taxed for. So the value of your property, the number of stories on your house, if you have any carts, any horses, any dogs. I feel like some years they're keeping track of like pool tables and pianos or something like that. But one of the other things that they're keeping track of is there's an additional tax for slave traders. If you want to be a slave trader in the city, they usually make a note of it on the tax forms. And you know, I think Alexandria charges you $100. I've seen the DC charges $400 for slave traders. And so it's a very useful tool for archaeologists here in the city. When we go into a project, one of the first things we pull out after like the maps is we go to the tax lists, and it tells us who's living there. And if you do year after year, you can see who's moving in, who's moving out. You can watch the assessed value of the property change as like the buildings get older or new additions get built, stuff like that. That's also a good question. The original, we went looking for the originals once, and that was a wild goose chase that I think comes down to Alexandria bouncing around a whole bunch and nobody really knowing. They're microfilmed. Most of them are microfilmed. You can get to them at special collections or the Library of Virginia. So Franklin's mostly living in either Tennessee or New Orleans. He's sort of handling the business down there, but John Armfield's the one who's up here. So John Armfield, it's hard to say at first. He may be living in the building for a couple of years. Towards 34, 35, 1836, he gets himself this giant house on Prince Street between Patrick and Henry. It's where the Virginia Tech School of Architecture is now. I didn't put it in here. There's one photograph that shows like the top half story of the building, but we don't have any other photographs of it. And again, like the rest of these, nobody took a picture of his house. It's a picture of a train station that in the background behind a tree is this building. It started off as a detached kitchen. If you go into the building now, towards the back of the museum, you can see in the brickwork the original seam that separated the kitchen from the passageway that connects the kitchen to the main block. And so this map probably shows it the best, but you have a detached wing in the back that, you know, one of the pieces that we're the most not sure about is when this gets filled in and connected. And it may not be during the Civil War. This wall exists. You know, we have the photograph from inside the yard looking this way that shows this wall, but we don't have any good views sort of inside the yard here. You know, there's the one from like the roundhouse looking this way that you can see where the top of a two-story passageway would be, and it's not there. But beyond about 16 feet off the ground, we can't see any of it. So yes, it probably doesn't get built at the same time, like exactly the same time. From the tax lists, this goes in 1812 or 1813, and then the assessed value of the property jumps up by about $1,000 the following year, which seems to suggest that the kitchen's the next thing that they build after they move into the house. So it's a detached kitchen, it's attached now. I've heard that, and I haven't been able to track down anything related to that. I mean, we have a PhD student who is who asked that same question to get herself started, and again, we're sort of at the mercy of the data sets we have available to us. Like, there's no good pre-Civil War photographs that show what's up there. You know, there's the that one bird's eye view that doesn't show, where is it? This sort of shows that neighborhood, but it's, I mean, it's sparse. Short of like, the conversation with her concluded that like, if you want to know the answer, the only way to do it is to sit down with the tax lists every year and reconstruct every block for every year. And she didn't sound like she wanted to do that very much. I don't blame her. It's the reason I haven't done it. But I mean, that's sort of my sense too. It's at the edge of town. There's stuff in the vicinity. You know, there's stuff across the street. People own those properties. George Kephart tries to sell it a couple times in the early 1850s, and he keeps saying, like, he says two things. Number one, like, this building contains 150,000 bricks if you want them. And then the second thing he says is, or you could turn it into a tavern or a hotel very easily. And so he's not trying to sell it like as a slave jail. He's trying to convince other people to come in and buy it and take it off his hands for him. So I don't have a good answer. Okay, yes, Al. One more. I'll give Al, last word to Al. We had that conversation internally a couple weeks ago. That's the next step, right? I mean, thinking forward what we want this building to be, what the city wants to do with it, I think that's the next big goal. And so, are those post-Civil War, many of them are post-1905 changes to the building to turn it into, from a boarding house into separate apartments? Are those more architecturally significant than surviving slave jail infrastructure? I agree. And so, you know, the Secretary of Interior has standards for renovations and restorations, and I think what we're thinking about is very clearly falls in line with a restoration of the property. So it's a conversation that we have to have, but I think there's well-established precedent for doing what I think we want to do to it. Thank you.